It gives me great pleasure to introduce Tomas. He's a lecturer in Spanish Studies in SAAA, with a focus on world literatures in Spanish and Latin American literatures of the 20th and 21st century. He analyzes literature's various interactions with the ecologies, artistic, political, and commercial, etc., and traces their circulation and reception at national and regional and at a global strata. His first monograph, which we'll be chatting about today, published by Lexington Books, is entitled McOndo Revisited. Is that right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Fabricio, our colleague, as well, also in Spanish, some of his research areas include popular genres, crime fiction, political thrillers, post-dictatorial Southern Cone, and his book also came out last year with Lexington Press, and it's entitled Latin American Detectives Against Power, Individualism, the State and Failure in Crime Fiction. So I'll hand it over to you guys.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here today. I will start by saying just a few words about McOndo Revisited, and then I'm going to ask the author, who we have the pleasure to be here with, a few questions, which are also comments on his work and which would hopefully trigger some conversation, some debate. McOndo's Revisited subtitle, The Making of a Generation-Defining Anthology in the Latin American Literature World, makes the book sell itself short. They don't really do it justice. The task that Tomas undertook here is far more interesting. The anthology he examines is just a case study, something that allows him to produce a brilliant theorization of the dynamics involved in the history of Latin American literary field over the 20th century. In this book, Tomas engages in an insightful conversation with Pierre Bourdieu, and even more so with his most prominent disciple, the late Pascal Casanova, and her works, The World Republic of Letters, and to a lesser extent, Kafka, Angry Poet. Tomas establishes a very productive dialogue both with Bourdieu's and Casanova's concepts, such as habitus and illusio, or Casanova's observations of Latin American literature within world literature. But Tomas's observations go beyond mechanistically applying Bourdieu's and Casanova's concepts to Latin American literature, as he complements what is lacking in the work of these French sociologists he's informed by. That is, an in-depth knowledge of the peculiar situation of Latin American literary and intellectual history beyond this 1990s anthology. That is sometimes easy to lose sight from the heights of sociology of literature or the word literature scholarship. On the other hand, and I'll finish with this, Tomas does not only contextualize thoroughly the historical conditions for the production of McOndo, the anthology, but he also leaves us wondering how come a great part of the previous critics missed so much about this anthology. Through a series of close readings of the prologue, the stories themselves, and the later trajectories of all the authors involved in the anthology, Tomas provides a nuanced reading that is lacking in most of the previous reception. By doing so, he offers us a practical example of how literature circulates in time and space, historically and through the literary field, as projections of stereotypes and prejudices, as a series of mistranslations and misunderstandings, in short, literature as misreading. Okay, so perhaps, Tomas, you could briefly start by talking on how you first became interested in Fuguet and Gómez's McOndo.
Thanks, Fabricio. I think I really have to thank you for those beautiful words of introduction and praise for my humble little book. I really appreciate it greatly, and it means a lot to me. So this is the anthology that my book is basically analysing and unpacking as its case study. It's called McOndo. My introduction to this, there's a lot to say about this, that's why I wrote a book. Essentially, my first introduction to this anthology was as an advanced Spanish student, and the way in which it was presented was we didn't actually read the stories, which was actually quite peculiar. I mean, when you think about literature, you normally read stories, fiction, imaginative works. The introduction to this anthology was by reading the prologue of this collection of stories, of short stories, and I thought, okay, that's peculiar. And one thing that really struck me about the prologue, which is called Presentación del País Macondo, Presentation of the Land of Macondo, is that it really struck many chords with my own existence, my own life, and my own experience of being Latin American. How's that? Well, I was born in Australia. I moved to Chile as a young boy and returned when I was around 7 or 8 years old. And I say 7 or 8 because I had my birthday basically when we were leaving. But when I came to Australia, I didn't really think much about my Latin American heritage. But when I did do advanced studies in Spanish at ANU, I came across this, this expectation, this a whole series of associations about what Latin America is, which completely jarred with my actual personal experience of it. For example, I would have people ask me, but like, don't you guys live like in like adobe huts and stuff like that over there? Or like, how is it that you drove, like Hondas and stuff like that? Or like how is that? I think there was a lot of kind of misperceptions about the kind of world that Latin America was back then, and even today, perhaps in some people's mind. And so when I read the literature, when I read this prologue, which very explicitly, I guess, confronts and combats some views that see Latin America as this kind of quaint, underdeveloped tropical paradise, or the McOndo, which is the village at the heart of Gabriel Garcia Marquez's novel 100 Years of Solitude. This village, which is, the site or the signifier of what became Latin American identity for millions and millions of readers around the world. I mean, this book has already been, I think, sold more than 37 million copies around the world in various languages. So the McOndo of this anthology was a satirization of this McOndo in 100 Years of Solitude, this McOndo of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, this kind of tropical folklorist view of Latin America. I don't think I'd ever really even worn a poncho in my life when I lived in Chile, but there was this expectation that we all walked around in ponchos. I wore jeans, I wore shorts and whatever, the life was not so different when I came to Australia. And in fact, it was actually odd because my experience of Latin America was actually almost an extreme form of the kind of capitalism that we'd actually see here in Australia. We have these huge malls in Santiago and where I come from in Viña. We have huge supermarkets, like make Woolies look like an IGA. And you just realize this is so different from the perceptions that my peers in the classroom kind of have of Latin American life. And so that's why I think it kind of struck me, that prologue that was fighting against these kind of stereotypes and in wanting to kind of renew perhaps images and perceptions of Latin American experience and relatedly, obviously, literature as well.
Mm-hmm. And of course, perhaps for people who are not necessarily familiar with the way McOndo, the Garcia Marquez McOndo is spelled, they're spelled differently, right? Maybe you want to...
That's right, yeah. So the McOndo in Garcia Marquez is MACONDO, McOndo. It's terrible because I don't know how to pronounce them in a differentiated way. It's like, in English, it's like McOndo and McOndo. My students probably like, what the hell, which one's he talking about? But essentially, yeah, it can be a bit tricky. But yeah, this McOndo, the clever or the joke in the prologue is that it's Mc, because in Latin America, we also have McDonald's, we also have Mac computers, and we also have condominiums, right? We live in condominiums, we live in apartments, we live in multi-story buildings, all these sorts of things. We don't live in adobe huts, and we eat McDonald's. And in fact, the anthology was so tongue-in-cheek that they launched it in a McDonald's franchise in Santiago in 1996. So it was really trying to push people's buttons and be quite overt and playful about it, right? I was thinking about getting McDonald's delivered for the catering, but I decided against that because I thought it would just be cold.
Had to be vegetarian. Right?
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
So the book is not just a series of close readings of the stories or the prologue, but also it is informed by a series of interviews you conducted to the authors themselves, and I believe you did them in person. So maybe I'd like for you to elaborate on that. How was your journey spatially and also throughout the writing of the book?
Yeah, so basically it's a real credit to the support that you get, and I have to give thanks to the ANU when I do my PhD here. There was a lot of support, financial support and encouragement to travel and to do research abroad and really to meet with people and find archives. And so with the help of my supervisor, we kind of made this decision, Danielle and I, that we would like to interview authors from a series of anthologies and try and interview as many of these, the 17 or 18 authors that are in this anthology, to get their take on it. Essentially, the reason why we wanted to do that is because the perception of the anthology was that this was a cohesive, collective movement against magical realism, against folkloric perceptions of Latin America. But in actual fact, it's really just this guy's kind of trip, Alberto Fuguet. And he sort of put all these authors together without them knowing in this anthology of young Latin American authors, and then wrote this really kind of polemical and controversial manifesto-like prologue, which apparently represented them. So the reason why I wanted to do these interviews is, A, the opportunity to kind of inquire after how much, in a sense, did they feel represented by the views of this anthology? How much was this a generational kind of sentiment, or did they completely miss the mark? Was he just tripping out? Was he, whatever? And what I found was that the incredible negative aura surrounding this anthology, because you might all think I've written a book on it, it must be really prestigious and respected anthology. The academics hated this book, like almost universally. Like it's literally, they think it's a terrible stain on Latin American letters. It's a bad mark. They couldn't. A lot of academics couldn't help but write about this to criticize it. Right? They should have just stayed quiet, as we'll get to later on, because that had an interesting effect on its canonization. But essentially, I wanted to ask them, what did you think of the anthology? Did you know about this kind of controversial prologue beforehand? None of them knew about the controversial prologue, right? Which was an interesting historical fact to kind of clarify. And none of them really wanted to be associated with McOndo. They didn't want to be known as McOndo authors. They're like, actually, it's kind of embarrassing that you're coming to talk to me about this one story. I've written like 5 or 6 novels. Like, why are you so interested in this one story? So it's kind of peculiar. But nevertheless, something that I think was quite a revelation that I detail in the book is that even if they didn't want to label themselves in any way as McOndo authors, they did espouse quite a lot of the views that McOndo put forward. One of them being that they didn't want to have the expectation or the constraint that they be writers that represent the nation, that they have to represent their national cultures and their national identities and kind of be a mirror to the people. There was this sense in the times where they wanted to write stories of whatever the hell they wanted. They didn't want to have to write the quintessential Bolivian story, the quintessential Argentinian novel, etc. They wanted to write against that kind of expectation. And that's something that's quite an important intervention from McOndo, right? It was interesting the way in which they kind of rejected it and at the same time implicitly agreed with some of its claims. And perhaps the most crazy example of this was, I traveled, to answer your question, to Chile, to the United States, because a number of these authors are in the United States now. I traveled to Spain and to Portugal as well. I got to interview them there. It's the best thing about working on contemporary fiction is you can actually talk to these authors, and like really, you can't really talk to, Sylvia Plath or anything like that as much as you like to. So essentially, I traveled around, and Alberto Fuguet was really interesting because he was my second interview, and it went terribly. It went really badly because he had been so scarred from the negative reception from academics. He had almost like a white coat hypertension and in fact, the first words he even said to me, we met up in a cafe, he just looked me up and down and he said, "Tu," like you, like really? He's like, what's this young kid like? Really? Like, I think he imagined academics, you know, like a different aura, different person, a different generation. He's like, what? Okay. And so he didn't get me then. And the interview went really badly in that he was like really tense and he was very critical of the anthology. He hated it. He said he wanted to bury it. He didn't want to be associated with it anymore. And yet at the same time, he felt he was right. So it was really hard to draw on that material in a sense. When you're trying to analyze their intervention and their commentary. But ever since then, it's kind of funny how, you know, I think scientists say that, you know, as a scientist, when you observe your subject matter, you kind of somehow affect it, you know, you modify it in some way by observing it. Well, I feel like I've done a little bit that with Alberto Fuguet, which I don't know if I'm proud of, or I don't know if that's a bad thing, but I feel like he's actually been warming to this idea that McOndo actually does have a real significant part to play in the literary history. And yeah, so we WhatsApp now and he like told me that like, the book, I'm so proud, I'm so amazed, you know, it's amazing. And I'm just like, oh wow, this is good.
You liked it as a hard copy?
He likes it as a hard copy, yeah, that's right. Anyway.
So going back to, or following up on what you're saying about literary history, reading your book reminded me of something that Borges wrote in the early 1980s about an Argentinian 19th century author called Esteban Echeverría, which is the first short story written in Argentina and some say in Latin America. And it's called Slaughterhouse. And he says about this story that there are authors who live in literary history and there are authors, the few, who live in literature itself. And he of course says that Echeverría lives in both. Considering that, as you know, the book, the anthology, became both a critical and a commercial failure, but nevertheless ultimately managed to achieve what it wanted, which was renewing the horizon of expectations towards what Latin America could be. Would you say that the McOndo authors belong to literary history or to literature itself?
That's a good question. And when you sent me that question, I was terrified because I didn't know how I would answer it. I think it's a great question. I think that, I mean, without knowing the real depth of what Borges was trying to get at, I'll read it superficially and see how I go. But I think, I mean, you mentioned something that I say in the book, which is that there's something odd about McOndo's canonization, right? And I talk about it as a canonization because even though everyone hated it, it's actually a kind of a canonization through negative aura, you know? Like, so essentially, it becomes so controversial, becomes so criticized by academics, and so many people are talking about it that it becomes worthy of mentioning. Like, you have to mention it when you talk about this generation of authors from the 1990s and 2000s, right? And so it becomes this reference point, this kind of watershed moment. And so it becomes again bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, a bit like a swear word, you know, like a swear word gets kind of more, you know, amplified the more you kind of try and like, don't use that word, you know? And so the sense to which, but then again, like it's kind of the idea of McOndo, it's kind of the prologue, it's kind of its claims that work to, as I call it, historicize literature at this time, you know, to make, to give us a sense of what's happening in the literature in Latin America at this time. Not so much as a canon, as an object, as a product, as a within the canon of works when you think about it as like a series of books or stories and the like. So what I argue towards the end of the book in the epilogue, riffing a little bit of Borges, Jorge Luis Borges, the Argentinian short story writer, is that essentially McOndo, I think, will sit always kind of alongside the canon, right? And I say that in relation to other kind of notable essays in the tradition. I feel that it's in the tradition of Borges' essay, El escritor argentino y la tradición, the Argentinian writer and tradition. Essentially, what I mean by that is that it's there as a product which I guess stands for a whole series of sentiments and ideas that capture something of that aesthetic moment, of that feeling, of that zeitgeist of the time, you could say. And particularly, it worked and you mentioned the impact of the anthology. This is another thing that I wanted to look after in the interviews, to basically try and understand, well, you know, what do people think is the impact of having talked about all these things, you know? All of the criticism generated conversations about, well, You know, what is the kind of perception that is projected about Latin America in the books by Isabel Allende or Garcia Marquez or Vargas Llosa, you know? What are people's perceptions when they read that, you know? Do they really think that we all live in the Amazon and stuff like that? And maybe maybe there's some point to it, etc., even if they don't agree with that. And so having those conversations, I feel as though it sits alongside the canon of works. I don't think I would even call anybody a McOndo author, except maybe Alberto Fuguet. I think he's probably the only McOndo author. He's like alone. And I wonder if he'd like that, to kind of be like a lone wolf, alone. One of the reasons why he said he developed this anthology was to find his literary peers. When all you see in the literary field is the literature of the great saints from behind you in the canon, it can be really hard to feel like, is anybody writing like about the stuff that I care about? Like, where are the people that are concerned with the same sort of things that I am? And so I think there's a sense to which that was that reaching towards that. And I think that's part of that literary history, much less so than a kind of canon of imaginative works. If that answers the question, I don't know how about it.
Even the co-author, the co-editor, you would say that wouldn't...
No. His trajectory I look at in the book as well, in a chapter on the literary trajectories of the authors. And I see him as going in a completely different direction. For him, this kind of McOndo aesthetic, these kinds of ideas, he was kind of like, it's kind of like he just joined for the ride for a little bit and then disappeared. And well, so his concerns became much more about genre fiction. He's obsessed with Sergio Gómez, I'm speaking about. Sergio Gómez is obsessed with police kind of thrillers and things like that, detective novels. And the interesting thing that arose in the conversation with him is that he described how in the Chilean literary field, there's like no conception of like the hard-boiled detective serialized novel. And so like he would publish a detective novel and then he'd go back to the same publisher and be like, can I publish a sequel? And they'd be like, what? Like, what are you talking about? Like, we don't do serialized fiction here. Like, it's a one-off. Like, go invent another detective. and so he was just like, it's like impenetrable. And so he basically, in a sense, and not like Fuguet, he kind of traded away some of that potential to become internationally renowned like Fuguet did because of this. And basically traded in for some kind of maybe more economic capital. He made a savvy decision, which is to start writing children's literature and make lots of money out of books that got listed on the national curriculum and things like that, so that he could have some time to write his detective novels that nobody wants to read. So it's really kind of interesting, the way it all works. Yeah.
In Spain, there's a beautiful expression. It goes, hay mucha tela para cortar. Literally, it means there's a lot of cloth to cut, but it expresses, we could best translate it as there's a lot of ground to cover. And I believe that this is the case with McOndo's prologue, which I insist, I believe you read brilliantly. One of the many things that struck me about rereading the prologue, the anthology prologue, is that Fuguet and Gómez note how the authors who they chose for McOndo were either living in Latin America or those who weren't had plans to return soon. And this caught me off guard because it sounded a bit chauvinistic. It sounded a bit against the aesthetics of the anthology. And almost 30 years after the publication of the anthology, the statement didn't really age well, right? Because as you show in chapter 3 and chapter 4, important writers of the anthology never really did their careers in Latin America. Some of them, like Rodrigo Fresan or Valencia or Jordi Soler, live in Spain. Some of them live in the US, like Mundo Paz Soldan or Yehia. So would you say that even though this contradicts Fuguet and Gómez's statement about authors being very Latin American, wanting to go back to Latin America, it paradoxically reinforces at the same time the idea that we are living in a McOndo world, a world defined by transnational ties and non-places such as airports, highways, and hotels?
Absolutely, yeah. I think that's a fair assessment. I think that Alberto Fuguet, this is why it's his kind of massive thing. It's very personal. I write in the book on a section on him and his habitus. Is essentially he as a young man he's born in Santiago in the 1960s, and he travels to Encino, California. He lives in California for a number of years. That's a first kind of cultural and identitary dislocation for him as a Chilean moving to California. And then he speaks about that quite fondly that time. He returns when he's 12 years old to Santiago, a second dislocation after somewhat getting accustomed to life in the United States. And then when he does his graduate studies at the Universidad de Chile, he basically, during the 1970s, 1980s, is confronted with an extremely Manichaean or dichotomized kind of view of cultural allegiances, right? So we're talking about the Nixon years. We're talking about years in which we've lived post the dictatorship, or during the dictatorship, post the golpe de Estado in Chile in 1973. We're speaking about a highly polarized society in Chile, and he's experiencing. He's basically in the Universidad de Chile, which is actually like the last communist stronghold in the nation, right? In the academy, and he is this Yankee kid, you know, he's this Americanized kind of young guy who is actually capable of doing a really interesting nuance, right? So for him, all of the kind of socialists and communists in the university setting were all like, everything about America is evil because they're the empire, they're the neo-colonizer, etc., right? So we have to confront that by burning US flags and by having protests and all these sorts of things. We can't listen to American music, etc., okay? And he's just like, well, look, he's like, well, I can't kind of, in a sense, this speaks to his two dislocations, right? In the United States, he can't leave behind his Chileanness. And when he comes back to Chile, he doesn't want to leave behind his Americanness, right? Those kind of aspects of American culture that he fell in love with, like the literature of Bret Easton Ellis, of Charles Bukowski, of, you know, the Beat Generation, of movies and cinema that he loves. You know, he loves American cinema, and he's actually a filmmaker as well. And so there's a sense to which he tries to kind of move beyond this kind of Manichaean or this kind of black and white vision of Latin Americans' relationship with the United States. And what ends up and what ends up happening, you know, what history ends up showing in some sense is that you know, all of these Che Guevara t-shirt wearing kind of socialists, which is a legitimate and valuable struggle, no doubt, all ended up listening to disco music and rock music and punk music and Nirvana and, you know, getting obsessed with and drinking Coca-Cola and everything. Everyone's been co-opted by this kind of globalization in the end anyway, right? And so there's a sense to which, as controversial as it sounds, he's kind of right, you know, and maybe he was the one who maybe more embraced it more openly or was more willing to acknowledge that that was happening. But certainly, you know, like in even other authors I've interviewed were very clear about, like, well, it's true, like, you know, and in fact we've moved to New York and we love New York, and it's, you know, so it's an interesting question, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So here comes the debate. My biggest objection, for lack of a better word, I have with the book is how it repeatedly reproduces the notion of center and periphery, following Italian Franco Moretti's ideas on world literature, but more broadly the theory of dependence posited by many Latin American thinkers. Use these poles in many instances to talk about literary struggles in what you call the Latin American literature world that we see here in the subtitle of the book, which we could roughly define as the transnational literary fields of the Hispanic world, right? And you outline how some presses from wealthier economies, specifically from Spain, France, and the United States, gave international visibility to Latin American writers. Not just from the anthology, but before, right? But you also use center and periphery to discuss Garcia Marquez' McOndo, the one that we write differently to the one on the book cover, magical realism, and mestizaje, which, for those of you who are not familiar with the term, is a common word used in Latin American studies to describe what essentially is the racial and cultural diversity found in the region's history and identity. So partially, but not fully indigenous, partially, but not fully European, and I would also like to add partially, but not fully African. At some point, you bring up Latin American intellectuals who describe Latin American literary identity not unlike Moretti's conjecture, and I'm citing you here, that the peripheral novel is made up of foreign form and local content, respectively, the modern novel and what you call Latin American's oral traditions, myths, and marginal cultures. And here I'd like to bring a book that you mentioned in chapter 1, Eduardo Galeano's influential The Open Veins of Latin America, which includes an old indigenous saying from Bolivia, who insists, I'm quoting here Galeano, that 3rd century Spain got enough metal from Potosí, which is a little town in Bolivia, to make a silver bridge from the tip of the cerro to the door of the royal palace across the ocean. So if we can't conceive modern Europe without Potosí, or more to the point, if we can't conceive Spanish presses like Seix Barral without Latin American literature, can we really keep talking about center and periphery? Can we really side with Moretti and understand the modern novel as a form that is truly foreign to Latin America, when novel itself has originated and developed as a byproduct of colonization, right? We only think, or we need only to think of Spanish picaresque novel or Robinson Crusoe. So to put it differently, isn't the so-called central novel from Europe also peripheral, marginal, or in short, mestiza? And conversely, isn't Latin America central to world literature much more than Casanova or Moretti would be ready to admit?
Thank you. I think there's always more to it than first appears, and I think that Moretti. I'm very ambivalent about Franco Moretti's conjectures on world literature. I think that it's too. Like you say, it's kind of too simplistic, right? I completely agree with that. I think that I think that what I was trying to outline in that part, or what I think I did outline in that part of the book, was essentially this interesting parallel between these conjectures that these world literature theorists are generating about literature in the sense of in the world, and in the way in which the novel has traveled as a form throughout, and Mariano Siskin speaks about this, the globalization of the novel as a form, and the way in which a path of entry into circulation into that globe of areas in the periphery has been to kind of adopt that form of art and to infuse it with those kind of local elements, right? And I don't think, as a general conjecture, that's not too far from the mark. I do have, I think there's so much nuancing that has to happen there, like you do. I think that additionally, for me, the model which has been developed by Pascal Casanova is far more convincing. And her model is more convincing, I think, because she posits literature as a world akin to the way in which we conceive of like the political world, right? We conceive about, people have this offhand phrase, they talk about, well, like everything's political, right? And it's like, well, yeah, you can kind of read everything as a political engagement or a disengagement, or as like, we're talking about governments having relative autonomy and things like that. I think when you start to think of literature as a world and you start to think about decisions that authors make within the options afforded to them or not, you start to realize, well, actually, in that world, there are hierarchies, and as much as we would like to ignore those or imagine they don't exist, that's just, to me, a kind of a form of wishful thinking. I think that it was revealed quite clearly in some of the case studies that I looked at. For example, the Argentinian. So what I do with this concept of the Latin American literature world is a concept that I'm developing to describe this transnational field of Spanish literature in the Americas and in connection with Spain, right? And why I call it a world is because I feel like all of those dynamics that are occurring in the literature, the globe, the world, between you have nations which are incredibly important in terms of their publishing or their symbolic capital, like for example, Gallimard, like a French press like Gallimard, or you might take New York or London as really significant and important publishing capitals. And then you might say, well, in the context of that, Canberra, is not really a literary capital. No one would imagine Canberra, you know what I mean? Like, when I was at Harvard in July, I was like, the reason why this place can attract 150 people from all around the world is because it's Harvard, baby, right? Like, you couldn't run this in Canberra. You couldn't bring people to come here as much as you wanted to, So it's like these are what we call illusios, right? It's all a game in a sense, right? So we're invested in that. We project and we incarnate the symbolic value that we believe a certain place or a certain publisher or a certain author or a certain tradition holds. So this actually comes into play in the Latin American literature world, where you have those similar dynamics and hierarchies at play. So there's the sense to which Mexico and Argentina hold quite strong publishing and symbolic prestige within the Latin American literature world. And certainly so in respect to a country like Nicaragua or Puerto Rico, for example, right? And then in between then, you have this whole spectrum of nations kind of combating, there's a lot of military discourse, right? Against each other for like literary circulation, representation, their identity, these sorts of things. And so I would say that, the semi-periphery thing is far too simplistic. I think it's so much more complicated, and it's really hard to detail those things. But it actually ends up favoring authors in Argentina, like Rodrigo Fresán, like Juan Forn, who are highly successful and have quite a smooth path, That's like, we can't get enough of these Argentinian authors in Spain. We love them. They're just like Borges, they're just like Cortázar. It's so great, we love them. And then a Costa Rican author comes along, Rodrigo Fresán, who in this book had published more novels, more short story collections, more poetry collections than any other author in this book. And he's like still in Costa Rica, completely unknown, publishing with small university presses in Costa Rica still, right? Or with small independent presses in Spain, He's not reaching this global translations and all this sort of things that some of the other authors are. So I think that those inequalities are real. And as much as we might shy away from describing them, I think we do. And if I'm wrong in my description, correct me. But I think that we shouldn't shy away from describing inequalities. It's perhaps one of the only tools we have to kind of start considering how to overcome them. Yeah, but last thing I want to do is reinscribe them. But but we have to describe them. Yeah.
Okay, I think we have to allow a few minutes for
let's
discussion.
do that. Sure.
Any questions?
Any questions from the audience? Yeah, I think that one of the things that I draw strongly from Bourdieu and Casanova, and I feel is part of, not to talk myself up, but is part of the reason why you say I was able to see things that other critics weren't able to see, is the fact that critics evaluate literature on their own terms, and with their own kind of, as much as we don't like to hear it, with their own value judgments about what is literary and what is not literary, what is worthy of being written about and what is not worthy of being written about, in a sense, right? And I think that we all participate in that, in a sense, right? We kind of, and so what you're saying speaks true to me, right? So you might have a field which fetishizes, it's a great word, a particular genre, a particular style. In Chile, they fetishized poetry, and they did for over 100 years. Like that was the Chilean genre, poetry, right? And to the point where everyone's just like, well, what is there left to write? Like there's a sense to which, like, really, like we have Neruda, we have Huidobro, we have Nicanor Parra. What else do we write, right? And then the novelists start to mock this, and they write novels called Chilean Poet and stuff like that, right? Alejandro Zambra. So yeah, there's a sense to which that's all at play, I think. Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not a specialist in Australian literature, so I couldn't possibly comment with any expertise on Australian literature. I think that it's interesting. For me, I'm obsessed with anthologies, and I don't know why, but I think as a genre, they fascinate me. And I do think that, and maybe there is some way I can speak to what you're saying, is that anthologies, I think, become tools of survival for a literature that's emerging, right? A literature that's emerging that hasn't quite gotten a foothold, hasn't quite gotten the attention of publishers to commit to basically publish 1,000 copies or 2,000 copies of the book of this unknown author, right? And so an anthology ends up being a testing ground to actually determine whether there is kind of a readership, whether there is interest, whether there actually does they generate kind of following and things like that. I don't know how much Australian literature engages with anthologies. I know certainly there are anthologies of First Nations literature in Australia, and magazines and things like that as well that also anthologize, right? Even if they're not anthologies. So I think that there's something to that, but I couldn't possibly comment with any expertise, and I probably should shut up now.
Next project.
The next project, yeah, maybe. I mean, this is the beautiful thing about considering literature as a world, is that you actually make those comparisons across the world, right? You're not obsessed with the specificity of your national framework to assume that it is so unique and uncommon that you can't make those comparisons. In fact, when you start to consider the literature as a world, you start to see those commonalities across the world, right? And it is possible to make those connections, I think, yeah, for sure. Can I read you the first line of my first paragraph of my book? Okay, because it speaks exactly to what you're saying, right? This is either a terrible hook or a great hook, I'm not sure. When I began researching this book on the McOndo anthology, scholars would react with a mix of surprise and at times with disapproval. They would suggest that McOndo, its prologue, and most unfortunately, in their mind, its principal ideologue, Alberto Fuguet, had already received more critical attention than they deserved. And in any case, they would add, and here comes the crazy bit, is there really much more to be said about the Macondistas or the McOndo generation than we already know? Just a boys' club of neoliberal, globalization sympathizing, North American culture devouring, Barrio Alto Latin Americans who decided to get together, make a scene, and get infamous just to sell books. The short answer is yes, the longer answer is this book. So essentially, like, yeah, so one of the criticisms was like kind of like what Locke was talking about, like there's this fetishization of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, which in a sense is right and just. I mean, like he's second only to Cervantes in the amount of success, both kind of like critical and commercial, right? Massively so. If you look at the sales, like it's insane, right? And so it's read as a critique on him, which it wasn't. It was a satirization. It was a joke, you know. It's read as a critique of magical realism, which it is, because this is the genre which has come to define Latin America as kind of folklorist and like, I guess, yeah, backwards and kind of quaint and cute and yeah, etc. Like a fairy tale. Essentially, and there was additional critiques. For example, this anthology only included men, right? Which in the 1990s, what some might say was unsurprising, but they still received a critique, which is valid, I think, for sure. And they could have easily included, for example, Mariana Enriquez, who was publishing in the 1990s as well in Argentina, but they already had their 3 Argentinians, so they're kind of like. They capped it, like, no, you're out, And they could have had Nulley-Valdés, a Cuban author, but she was writing 2 folkloric, magical realist kind of texts. And so they're like, no, you're not in, you're out, And so there was gatekeeping that went on, for sure, But they had also experienced their gatekeeping, And the prologue of the anthology speaks about them, about Alberto Fuguet going to the international writing program, in Iowa. And basically this editor been really interested in his work and like, oh my gosh, we're going to translate you. Isabel Allende is selling like hotcakes here in America. You're going to make millions. It's going to be great. He gives him the story, and then the professor at Iowa and the editor of the Iowa Review says to him, but this is not Latin American enough, This is not magical realism. Where's the levitating grannies and like what's going on? Like, and it's just grunge realism, Like I don't want that. And so he got rejected, right? And so then they basically, I probably should have said this at the beginning, but anyway, this sets the scene for their prologue. It's basically like we're writing against this perception, Yeah. So that's, and also I must add, the academy is also a target for their prologue. So naturally, academics were going to be like defensive about it. And it's like, how dare you suggest that we only care about, these things? So this is why I developed this term Latin American literature world, because I feel like it's better to speak about the ways in which things circulate or are spoken about, discourses around things, than to say this one yes, this one no, this one yes, you know, like a canon of works, right? And this is analogous to what happens in world literature theory in the last 25 years. Basically, there was a movement against world literature programs in defining what is the canon of world literature, what are the greatest works, you know, to actually turning world literature into a method and an analyzing processes of circulation and canonization, translation, all that sort of stuff. And so I try and mimic that, but I try to conceive of Latin American literature as those kind of authors and works that circulate beyond their national space within Latin America and have necessary, perhaps in some words, connection with Spain, right? There's the sense to which the market really, you know, revolves around Spain in many senses, because that is the country which has the most developed, one might say, publishing infrastructure and mechanisms of consecration and canonization. So there's no doubt about that Spain actually, strangely enough, forms part of the Latin American literature world, or maybe not strangely enough, but yeah, for sure. Great question. I think we should have a celebration. I should also, before you clap, I should say thank you. I haven't said thank you to anybody, right? So, and I really want to say thank you to my parents and to my wife who have graced me with their presence here, and my great aunt and uncle who are here, who were the first Chileans from our family to come to Australia, and so it was wonderful to have them here as kind of my proxy grandparents, you could say. I want to thank the school, SLL, who's housed me for before its existence, really, when I was a student here, and my colleagues in the Spanish department, Fabricio for reading the book and giving it such wonderful kind of questions and discussion today, and my colleagues in SLL and HDR students that I went on the journey with. My students, who I love, you guys are rock, okay? All right, and friends. Thank you very much. Let's have some champagne. Yeah.